back to another video. Today I'm going to be covering a solved murder case, and this one is quite a sad one. I mean, all cases are sad, but this one does involve young children. So if things like that affect you really easily, then you don't have to watch this, but just that's a little warning. It does affect a lot of people out there, and yeah, so yeah, it's a really heartbreaking one to listen to and to research. It was very sad. I want to let you know that everything that I found, I've just found on the internet, and I don't mean to disrespect anyone that's spoken about in the video. But yeah, this is the Andrea Yates case, and it's the bathtub murderer. So Andrea Yates, originally Andrea Kennedy, was born on the 2nd of July 1964 in Houston, Texas. She was the youngest of 5 siblings. She had 3 brothers. They were called Andrew, Patrick and Brian, and she had a sister called Michelle. Her mum was a German immigrant, and she was called Jutta Karen Kohler. I think that's how you pronounce it, don't quote me on that. I think that's how you say her name. And her dad was Andrew Emmett Kennedy. So Andrea was quite a good student. She went to Milby High School in Houston, and she graduated there in 1982. She was class valedictorian, and she was also captain of the swimming team, and she was also an officer in the National Honor Society. She went to University of Houston and she completed a 2-year pre-nursing program. She then graduated the University of Texas School of Nursing in Houston in 1986, and then she did go on to work as a registered nurse at the University of Texas MD Anderson Cancer Center, and she did that from 1986 to 1994. So Andrea was quite a reserved person. She didn't really talk to guys, and she lived in this complex apartment, and so did Rusty, her partner that she met. Rusty saw her lying in a pool with like her arms out, and she was laying back, but she wasn't interested in Rusty. But the more she saw him about, the more she did, and quite out of character for Andrea, but she did initiate the first conversation with Rusty. So after a few years, they did move in together, and they spent most of their time in religious studies and prayers, and they got married on the 17th of April 1993, and they did say that they would they planned to have as many children as nature provided, and altogether they had 5 children, and they were called Noah, John, Paul, Luke. So not even after a year of them being married, they welcomed their first little boy, Nate, and his name was Noah Jacob, and he was born on the 26th of February 1994. She adapted quite well to being a mother. She did do quite well, and then on December the 15th 1995 they welcomed another little boy called John Samuel. After, in 1996, Rusty took a job in Florida, so they all moved up to Florida, and they lived there for a bit, and they moved into a 38-foot-ish travel trailer, and that was in Seminole, Florida. However, I couldn't find what day, so I don't know if this was before Paul was born or after, so I will just say that on September the 13th 1997 welcomed Paul Abraham to the family, and then they also moved back to Houston in 1997, so I couldn't find which was first, if they moved back to Houston and then they had Paul, or if they had Paul and then moved back to Houston. I couldn't find that out, but yeah, they moved back to Houston in 1997 and they also had Paul in 1997. And they lived in a trailer because Rusty had said that he wanted to live light. Next year they got another 350 square foot renovated bus, and that would be their permanent home. That's where they wanted to live for the rest of their lives, so that's what they wanted to. But having 4 children living in this tiny bus, it was cramped, and that didn't help on Andrea's mental health. While she was pregnant with John, Andrea stopped activities that she usually did, like jogging and swimming, and just socialising. She started to become more introverted and isolated from everyone, and they also homeschooled their children, so yeah, it did start to have an effect when they moved into this smaller place. On February the 15th, 1999, they welcomed another boy called Luke David. But then on June 16th, 1999, Rusty got a call from Andrea while he was at work saying that he needed to come home. She didn't say why, she just said, "I need your help." So he went home and he found her sat shaking, just shaking, involuntary, and also she was chewing her fingers. So she wasn't chewing like her nails, she was chewing her actual fingers, which is obviously very alarming. And at this point, Andrea's father got diagnosed with Alzheimer's, so she was caring for him as well as her children, which obviously doesn't help with her mental health. And she went to stay at mum and dad's, and she tried to overdose on her dad's sleeping pills. They took her to the hospital the night when she tried to overdose, and she was transferred to the Methodist hospital, and she was diagnosed with major depressive disorder. When discussing her problems, she was described as evasive, and on June 24th, 1999, she was prescribed with antidepressants and she was released. She followed this religion, would you call it a religion? I'm not sure, but it was like something to do with Saturn. She could feel like Saturn was talking to her, and they were against medications. Like, they said that all doctors were bad, all medication was bad, so she would act like she took the medication, so she'd put it in her mouth and then act like she took it and then go and spit it out, because obviously it was bad for you according to religion. I'm going to call it religion. I don't think it's a religion. So she didn't take the medication, which could have helped her become better, but obviously she didn't. She would start ripping her hair out, creating bald patches. She'd refuse to feed her children because she felt like they were eating too much. She also thought there was cameras in her ceiling and watching her, and she also felt like the characters on TV were talking to her and her children, so she was hallucinating these characters talking to her and her children. She told Rusty about all of these hallucinations, but none of them said anything to the psychiatrist or to the hospital or anything, which you would. If you'd start having hallucinations, you are going to want to tell someone just so you can get that help. And then on the 20th of July 1999, Andrea put a knife to her throat and begged Rusty to just let her die, just let her do it. She wanted to end it. Again, I believe that was the characters had been telling her, or someone had been telling her in her head to do it, but she'd fight off to not do it. She also had marks on her because she was trying to hold herself back from doing it, but she just, on this day, she grabbed a knife, put it near her throat and begged Rusty to let her die, but Rusty wasn't going to let that happen, and she wrestled the knife off of her and eventually got it away from her. She then stayed in a catatonic state for 10 days and she was treated with drugs and injections, and she was prescribed with Hadol. And she seemed to improve. Her mental state did improve a bit. A lot of people saw this great improvement. Rusty was very optimistic for the future and for the children, but they was warned about the risk of having another child. They said that if she had another child she might become psychotic again. And while this was happening, Andrea's mum sat Rusty down and told him to move out of that renovated bus because it wasn't helping her mental state. Having like 4 children in this tiny bus isn't going to help you as a mother. You're gonna struggle. They moved into a lovely house which was big enough and in a lovely little neighbourhood, and Andrea returned to her old past activities, so like cooking and swimming, and she actually started socialising a little bit more, and she had strong hopes for the future. She really did, and she did express this to Rusty. She was very, again, she was also optimistic for the future. She still viewed her life on the bus as a failure, so that was still in her mind, but she did have hopes for the future. However, the mental illness didn't stop. It continued still. In March 2000, she became pregnant with a little girl called Mary Deborah, but also on the 12th of March her father passed away, who she'd been taking care of for years, and it really did hit her hard, and she stopped taking the Hadol that she was prescribed, and she just deteriorated again. She started pulling her hair out again and all this and that. She stopped talking, she refused to take liquids, she even didn't feed Mary, like, because you're meant to feed, when you're eating, you're feeding your children, you're feeding your child in your womb. That's how they grow. And she wouldn't feed Mary. So at the end of March she went to a different hospital and she was briefly treated with Hadol again. Her new psychiatrist didn't treat along with it because she didn't think that Andrea was psychotic enough to be on it. She was released, but then she was back in on May. I couldn't find what day, but she was back in May, and then was released again 10 days after. So now this is the hard hitting bit, the like very emotional bit. They are quite, not gruesome, but it's not nice to hear. So if you don't want to watch this little bit, I'll put a little time stamp on so you can skip to after the deaths. Just if you don't want to watch that bit, then that's completely fine. But yeah, that's your little another warning. But on June the 20th 2001, Rusty left for work and his mum was going to come down and help Andrea look after the kids. But within the hour of Rusty leaving and her mother-in-law coming down, she went upstairs and she filled the bathtub with water. Starting with Paul, she took him up and placed him under the water, eventually killing him and drowning him. She then did the same to Luke and John and placed them all on her bed. Then she went and grabbed Mary, who was only 6 months at the time. Paul was 3 at the time, Luke was 2, and John was 5. And so she got little 6-month-old Mary and put her in the bath and drowned Mary. And then she called her eldest up, who was 7, and that was Noah, and he looked at Mary and asked his mum what was wrong, like what's wrong with Mary, why is she like that. But before he had time to do anything else, she did grab Noah and did the same to Noah. I read on a couple of sources that he did try and fight and that he caught a couple of breaths a couple of times, but eventually he died. And she left Paul in the bath floating, and she grabbed Mary and she placed her in her brother John's arms on the bed. Now that hard bit is out of the way, she rang the police and they asked her what the problem was, and she just said that she needed them to come. They asked if they needed an ambulance, and she's like, no, police. But then she said, actually, yeah, no, bring an ambulance as well, I just need them to come. So then they did eventually get there. She also rung Rusty after she rung the police, and she says, you need to come home. And he said, is there something wrong? She said, yeah. And he said, with the children? And then she replied with, yes. And he said, how many of them? And she said, all of them. He's got there and asked, what was the problem? And she just bluntly said, I've killed my children. And not long after, I think Rusty arrived, and he was just, as you can imagine, your wife's just killed your children. He's going to be distressed and like confused. So he was like, why could you do this? How could you do this? What have you done? But they wouldn't let him in. He tried to look in the windows, but to try and talk to Andrea. However, the public was quite shocked after all this, because Rusty was still supportive of Andrea, saying that she wasn't thinking, it wasn't her that did it, it was her condition. He was quite supportive towards her. She explained to the police that she wasn't a good mother and that the children weren't developing correctly, that she needed to be punished. So she pled not guilty for reason of insanity. However, the jury did find her guilty of capital murder, but didn't give a death penalty. She got life in prison, and she is eligible for parole in 2041 when she is 77. However, there was another trial on July in 2006, and a jury of 6 men and 6 women found her not guilty by reason of insanity. So then she was moved to Kerrville State Hospital, which is a mental hospital. Rusty did divorce Andrea in 2005, and he is remarried and they have a baby together. Quite a hard-hitting case, not a nice one. I mean, none of them are nice, but it's very sad when it does involve children. Like, I know some people can get very emotional, like I was getting emotional, and it's hard. It is a hard story when it involves young children who haven't had their life yet. They've still had their whole life ahead of them, but they got that took away from them. So yeah, not a nice case to talk about, especially when it involves young children. But thank you if you did watch, thank you for watching, and again, if you've got any cases you want me to cover, leave comments down below to let me know what you want me to cover, and I will see you all next week with another video.